The spectacle of J.D. Vance's transformation from Trump critic to genuflecting courtier represents something more grotesque than mere political opportunism, though it certainly is that. Here we have a man who once possessed sufficient moral clarity to recognize Donald Trump as what he termed a cultural heroin peddler to the white working class, only to become, in a breathtaking display of self-abasement, the dealer's most eager apprentice. One searches the annals of American political prostitution for a comparable example of such wholesale abandonment of stated principle, and comes up remarkably short. Consider the archaeological evidence of Vance's previous life as a thinking person. In 2016, this Yale Law School graduate and author of that lachrymose memoir about hardscrabble Appalachian life was comparing Trump to Hitler, not, mind you, in the casual way that political opponents sometimes reach for hyperbole, but with what appeared to be genuine analytical conviction. He wondered aloud whether Trump might be America's Hitler or merely a cynical asshole. The fact that he has since answered his own question by choosing to serve said asshole with canine devotion tells us rather more about Vance than about Trump. The memoir that launched Vance into the firmament of conservative intellectualism, if one can use such a term without irony in the current context, was itself a masterwork of having it both ways. Hillbilly Elegy managed simultaneously to pathologize the poor whites of Appalachia as authors of their own misfortune, while positioning its author as their compassionate interpreter to the coastal elites. It was poverty porn dressed up as sociology, offering liberal readers the guilty pleasure of cultural voyeurism, while reassuring conservative audiences that systemic explanations for inequality were merely excuses for bad behavior. That this book became the Rosetta Stone for understanding Trump voters tells us less about its analytical value than about the desperate hunger of the commentariat for any explanation that didn't require examining the actual material conditions of American decline. But even this exercise in literary triangulation seems principled compared to Vance's subsequent metamorphosis. The man who once declared Trump unfit for our nation's highest office and called him noxious and reprehensible now serves as his vice president with an enthusiasm that would embarrass even the most shameless political opportunists. One must ask, what precisely occurred in the intervening years to transform this critic into a sycophant? Did Trump become less noxious? Did his fitness for office mysteriously improve? Or did Vance simply perform that calculation, familiar to every political climber since time immemorial, that principles are a luxury he could no longer afford? The answer requires no great detective work. Vance's transformation coincided precisely with his decision to run for the United States Senate from Ohio in 2022. Suddenly, the Hitler comparisons vanished like morning dew, replaced by elaborate genuflections toward Mar-a-Lago. The man who had worried about Trump's authoritarian tendencies began praising his leadership. The cultural heroin that Vance had diagnosed was apparently no longer a problem, or perhaps Vance had decided that dealing was more profitable than treating. What makes this transformation particularly contemptible is not merely its transparency, but its thoroughness. A more skillful politician might have managed a gradual evolution, maintaining some fig leaf of consistency. But Vance, with the zealotry of the convert, has embraced every aspect of Trumpism with an enthusiasm that suggests either complete intellectual bankruptcy or a cynicism so profound it borders on the sociopathic. He now traffics in the very conspiracy theories and resentments he once diagnosed as pathological, promoting election denialism and the great replacement theory with the fervor of someone who has either lost his mind or sold his soul, though in contemporary Republican politics, the distinction may be academic. The servility reaches its apex in Vance's adoption of Trump's rhetorical style and obsessions. Here is a man who attended Yale Law School, who clerked for judges, who wrote a best-selling book, now reduced to tweeting barely literate provocations and defending the indefensible with the mechanical determination of a chatbot programmed by Steve Bannon. He has become, in essence, a tribute act, Trump without the strange charisma, the authoritarian without the authority, the demagogue without even the excuse of genuine demagoguery. One might charitably suggest that Vance genuinely changed his mind, that new evidence convinced him of Trump's virtues. But this would require believing that the Trump of 2024 is somehow more presidential than the Trump of 2016, that the January 6th insurrection enhanced rather than diminished his qualification for office, that 4 years of lies, grift, and attempted coup somehow vindicated what Vance once recognized as dangerous buffoonery. The charitable interpretation is actually more damning than the cynical one. It would mean Vance is not merely opportunistic, but actively delusional. The selection of Vance as Trump's running mate represents a perfect synthesis of contemporary Republican politics. The elevation of those who abase themselves most completely, the reward for intellectual flexibility that would make a yoga instructor envious, and the triumph of power over principle. That Vance was chosen precisely because of his willingness to transform himself from critic to courtier sends a clear message about what Trump values in his subordinates. Not loyalty to principle or country, but loyalty to him personally, purchased at the price of public humiliation. What does it say about the state of American conservatism that its rising stars are those who can most completely reverse their stated convictions? Vance is hardly alone in this parade of prostration. One thinks of Marco Rubio, Ted Cruz, and the entire roster of previously critical Republicans who have learned to love Big Brother. But he may be the most egregious example because his criticism was once so acute and his capitulation so complete. He has become the exemplar of what might be called the sycophant's trajectory, from critic to convert to evangelist, each stage requiring greater demonstrations of loyalty to prove the sincerity of the conversion. The irony, of course, is that the very working-class voters Vance claims to champion are the ones most damaged by the politics he now promotes. The cultural heroin he once diagnosed has become his stock in trade. The resentments and conspiracies that keep these voters from recognizing their actual interests are now the currency in which Vance deals. He has become precisely what he once criticized, a member of the elite who exploits rather than serves the people he claims to represent. In his memoir, Vance wrote about the importance of personal responsibility, about the need to reject the culture of blame and victimhood, yet he now serves a man whose entire political career is built on grievance, who accepts responsibility for nothing, who blames everyone but himself for any setback. The cognitive dissonance would be amusing if it weren't so consequential. Future historians, assuming we have them and they retain any capacity for moral judgment, will marvel at this period in American politics, when ambitious men and women so readily abandoned their stated principles for proximity to power. Vance will feature prominently in these histories, though tragedy requires some element of nobility, making him merely a cautionary tale about the price of ambition untethered from conviction. The most damning verdict on Vance is not that he changed his mind about Trump, but that he almost certainly didn't. Somewhere in whatever remains of his conscience, he knows what Trump is because he told us himself. He knows the damage Trump does to the very people Vance purports to care about because he wrote a book about it. He knows all this and chose to ignore it because the alternative was political irrelevance, and for men like Vance, irrelevance is the only unforgivable sin. There is something peculiarly American about this transformation, this ability to reinvent oneself completely without any apparent psychological cost. In another culture, such a complete reversal might require exile, or at least a period of quiet rehabilitation. But in America, and particularly in Trump's Republican Party, shamelessness is not a liability but an asset, and Vance has proven himself remarkably shameless. The tragedy, if one insists on finding tragedy in what is essentially farce, is that Vance clearly possesses intelligence and once showed signs of insight. His diagnosis of Trump as cultural heroin was apt, his concerns about authoritarianism prescient. That he has chosen to deploy these gifts in service of what he once recognized as dangerous and destructive speaks to a moral vacuum that no amount of political success can fill. As vice president, Vance now stands a heartbeat away from the presidency, this man who has proven that his convictions are entirely negotiable, his principles wholly subordinate to his ambitions. He represents the complete triumph of cynicism over conviction, of power over principle, of ambition over integrity. In this, he is the perfect running mate for Trump and the ideal representative of what the Republican Party has become, a vehicle for those willing to say anything, betray anyone, and abandon any principle in the pursuit of power. That he does so while still claiming to speak for the forgotten men and women of America only adds insult to what was already injury.